The future begins in the mind. What if the future you're waiting for is quietly being shaped, not by luck, not by fate, and not even by the opportunities that come your way, but by the person you believe yourself to be today? Pause for a moment, not because there's an answer waiting around the corner, but because some questions deserve silence before they deserve words. Every day, millions of people wake up believing that tomorrow will somehow be different. They promise themselves that they'll finally become disciplined. They'll finally write the book. They'll finally apply for the promotion. They'll finally start the business, repair the relationship, lose the weight, or pursue the dream they've carried for years. Yet tomorrow often arrives looking remarkably like yesterday. The alarm rings. The same thoughts return. The same routines unfold. The same doubts quietly whisper in the background. Weeks become months. Months become years. And one day, many people look back wondering where all the time went. It isn't usually because they lacked intelligence. It isn't because they never cared enough. And it certainly isn't because they never dreamed. The tragedy is often much quieter than that. It is the quiet repetition of familiar thinking. We often imagine that change begins with dramatic action, a bold decision, a powerful speech, a life-changing opportunity. But perhaps real change begins much earlier, long before anyone notices, long before circumstances shift, long before success becomes visible. Perhaps it begins with something almost invisible, a different way of seeing yourself. Imagine standing in front of a large window. Outside, two people are looking at exactly the same city, the same streets, the same buildings, the same weather. Yet, one person sees opportunity. The other sees obstacles. One notices possibilities. The other notices limitations. The city hasn't changed, only the lens through which it is being viewed. Human beings rarely experience reality exactly as it is. Instead, we experience reality through interpretation, through expectation, through memory, through belief. Psychology has shown again and again that what we expect influences what we notice. Our expectations affect where we direct our attention, how we interpret setbacks, and how persistently we pursue our goals. They do not magically rewrite the world, but they profoundly shape how we move through it. Think about two students preparing for the same difficult examination. One believes, I'm probably going to fail. The other believes, this will be difficult, but I can improve if I prepare well. Both study the same material. Both face the same questions. Both encounter moments of frustration, yet their expectations quietly influence their behavior. The first gives up sooner. The second stays with the challenge longer. One interprets mistakes as proof. The other interprets mistakes as feedback. Eventually, the outcomes begin to separate, not because reality favored one person, but because their beliefs shaped their responses to reality. This pattern appears everywhere, in careers, relationships, business, health, creativity. The stories we repeatedly tell ourselves become the frameworks through which we make decisions. And over time, decisions become habits. Habits become identity. Identity begins shaping the future. This isn't a mystical idea. It's a profoundly human one. We all carry invisible assumptions about who we are. I'm confident. I'm awkward. I'm lucky. I'm always overlooked. I finish what I start. I never stick with anything. Some of these stories help us. Others quietly limit us. The remarkable thing is that many of them were never consciously chosen. They accumulated. A comment from a teacher, a childhood experience, a painful rejection, a success that gave us confidence, years of repetition. Eventually, those ideas stopped feeling like opinions. They began feeling like facts. Yet one of the most liberating discoveries a person can make is that familiarity is not the same as truth. A belief can feel ancient without being accurate. A thought can feel convincing without being helpful. A fear can feel permanent without being inevitable. This realization sits at the heart of many enduring philosophical traditions. Across cultures and across generations, thoughtful people have returned to a similar question. If we cannot always choose our circumstances, can we choose the way we meet them? Nearly a century ago, a teacher named Neville Goddard invited people to consider that question from a unique perspective. His work has inspired readers for decades. Some regard his teachings as spiritual philosophy. Others interpret them through psychology. Still others reject them entirely. But regardless of where someone stands, one phrase from his work has continued to capture attention: living in the end. Few ideas have been quoted so often and perhaps misunderstood so often. Some hear the phrase and imagine pretending that life is already perfect. Others assume it promises instant success if you simply think positively enough. Still others dismiss it without ever exploring what it might actually point toward. But what if the phrase isn't really about pretending? What if it's describing something much more practical? Something we see reflected in athletes mentally rehearsing a performance before competition, in musicians imagining a flawless recital, in entrepreneurs making decisions based on the company they hope to build rather than the one they currently have, in ordinary people who slowly become the kind of person their daily choices reflect. Perhaps living in the end is less about escaping reality and more about aligning your present behavior with the future you genuinely want to create. Think of an architect. Before a building exists in steel and concrete, it exists as a plan, not because the drawing magically constructs the building, but because clear vision guides deliberate action. Without a blueprint, construction becomes random. Without direction, effort becomes scattered. The same principle applies to life. The future is built twice, first in the imagination, then in action. The imagination alone is not enough. Action without direction is rarely enough either. Transformation often begins when vision and behavior begin moving together. Modern psychology offers fascinating insights here. Research on mental rehearsal suggests that vividly practicing a skill in the mind can improve preparation when combined with real practice. Studies on self-concept suggest that people tend to behave in ways that are consistent with how they see themselves. Behavioral science reminds us that repeated actions reinforce identity, just as identity influences repeated actions. Notice the pattern: expectation, attention, choice, action, identity. These ideas are deeply connected. If you constantly see yourself as someone who cannot change, you'll often notice evidence that confirms it. If you begin seeing yourself as someone capable of learning, you'll likely become more willing to attempt difficult things. Not because the universe suddenly changed, but because you did. The greatest prison is rarely built from stone. It is built from unquestioned assumptions. The greatest freedom is rarely found by controlling every external event. It is found by learning to examine the beliefs quietly directing your life. So as we continue this journey together, I want to invite you to set aside two extremes. Set aside blind belief, and set aside immediate skepticism. Instead, bring curiosity. Curiosity asks better questions. Curiosity allows ideas to be explored rather than defended. Curiosity creates room for growth. Throughout this audiobook, you won't be asked to suspend reason. You won't be asked to ignore reality. You won't be told that every setback is an illusion or that every dream is guaranteed. Instead, we'll explore something both simpler and perhaps more demanding: how your expectations influence your attention, how your attention influences your choices, how your choices reinforce your identity, and how your identity quietly shapes the direction of your life. Because maybe the greatest misunderstanding isn't about Neville Goddard at all. Maybe it's about ourselves. Maybe we spent years waiting for confidence before taking action, when confidence often grows after action. Maybe we've waited for certainty before beginning, when certainty is usually discovered along the way. Maybe we've been searching for permission from the outside, when the most important permission has always come from within. As we begin Chapter 1, we're going to look at the phrase that has fascinated readers for generations. What does living in the end actually mean? And why have so many people interpreted it in ways that obscure its deepest insight rather than reveal it? Chapter 1. Why living in the end is so often misunderstood. A young entrepreneur sat alone in a nearly empty office on a Friday evening. The company had been losing money for months. The investors were growing impatient. Friends had quietly begun suggesting that perhaps it was time to look for a real job. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Nothing was working. Yet every Monday morning, the entrepreneur walked back into that office with the same quiet routine. The desk was organized. The goals were reviewed. Calls were made. Ideas were tested. The behavior never suggested someone who believed the journey was over. Years later, people would describe that person's success as confidence. But confidence wasn't what came first. A decision came first. A decision to behave consistently with the future that seemed impossible to everyone else. This is where many people misunderstand one of Neville Goddard's most discussed ideas. The phrase living in the end has inspired millions of people, but has also created endless confusion. Some hear those words and conclude that they simply need to pretend everything has already happened. Others believe it means ignoring present challenges. Some reduce it to wishful thinking. Others dismiss it entirely because they assume it asks people to deny reality. Perhaps none of those interpretations capture the deeper point. Perhaps the real question has never been, can thought magically change reality? Perhaps the better question is, what happens when a person's deepest expectations begin influencing the way they think, notice, decide, and act? That question belongs as much to psychology as it does to philosophy. Every human being carries an internal picture of who they are. Some people see themselves as resilient. Others see themselves as unlucky. Some quietly believe they are leaders. Others assume they will always remain in the background. Most of these beliefs are never spoken aloud. They simply become the operating system running beneath daily life. A person who believes they are capable doesn't wake up every morning repeating motivational phrases. They simply make different decisions. They volunteer for opportunities. They recover more quickly after setbacks. They tolerate uncertainty a little longer. Their expectations quietly influence their behavior. Likewise, someone convinced they are destined to fail often behaves differently without realizing why. They hesitate. They overthink. They postpone. They notice rejection more quickly than encouragement. Eventually, the results seem to confirm what they believed all along. The belief didn't determine reality by itself, but it influenced the path they repeatedly chose. Psychologists sometimes refer to this process as the expectancy effect. Expectations can shape attention, motivation, persistence, and interpretation. If two people encounter the same obstacle while holding different expectations, they may walk away with completely different conclusions. The obstacle remains identical. The meaning does not. A marathon runner doesn't stand at the starting line believing the race has already been completed. That would be absurd. Instead, they carry a clear expectation about the kind of athlete they are becoming. That expectation affects today's training. It influences what they eat, when they wake up, whether they continue after difficult sessions. The future changes today's choices, not because the future has already arrived, but because the future has become a reference point. This distinction matters. Living in the end is often misunderstood because people confuse vision with fantasy. Fantasy asks reality to change while nothing else changes. Vision quietly changes the person moving through reality. Those are very different things. There is another misunderstanding that deserves attention. Many people believe that if they still experience fear, uncertainty, or doubt, then they are somehow doing it wrong. Life doesn't work that way. The most accomplished athletes still feel nervous before competition. Successful entrepreneurs still question difficult decisions. Writers still stare at blank pages. Surgeons still prepare carefully before complex procedures. Confidence is not the absence of uncertainty. Confidence is continuing despite uncertainty. Perhaps living in the end has less to do with never experiencing doubt, and more to do with refusing to let doubt become your permanent identity. Consider two employees working in the same company. Both receive constructive criticism during their annual review. The first employee hears, "You're capable, but this area needs improvement." They spend the evening thinking, "Good, now I know what to work on." The second employee hears exactly the same feedback. Their inner dialogue sounds different. "This proves I'm not good enough." The conversation was identical. The interpretation wasn't. From that moment forward, each person's behavior begins moving in a different direction. One asks better questions. The other begins protecting themselves from future criticism. One grows. The other withdraws. Again, expectations influence behavior. Behavior shapes outcomes. Outcomes reinforce identity. This loop repeats quietly over years. Modern neuroscience reminds us that the brain is constantly filtering information. Every second, it receives far more sensory input than conscious awareness can process. Attention becomes selective. You notice what appears relevant. You remember what feels meaningful. You overlook countless details without realizing it. This means your expectations can influence what stands out in your environment. Someone preparing for a new business opportunity suddenly notices ideas everywhere. Someone learning photography begins noticing light differently. Someone expecting rejection may become highly sensitive to signs of disapproval while overlooking encouragement. The external world has not fundamentally changed. The mind has adjusted its spotlight. Living in the end, viewed through this lens, becomes less mysterious. It resembles intentionally directing that spotlight toward possibilities rather than permanently fixing it on limitations. Mental rehearsal provides another interesting perspective. Elite athletes frequently visualize performances before competitions. Musicians mentally practice difficult passages. Pilots rehearse emergency procedures. Researchers have found that mental rehearsal can improve preparation when paired with real-world practice. The rehearsal itself is not a substitute for action. It supports action. It prepares the mind to perform when the moment arrives. There is an important lesson here. Visualization without effort produces very little. Effort without direction often becomes scattered. Together, they become far more powerful. Perhaps this is closer to what many people overlook. Living in the end is not abandoning reality. It is allowing a meaningful vision of the future to organize present behavior. Relationships reveal this principle beautifully. A person who believes healthy relationships require honesty behaves differently during conflict. They communicate. They apologize when necessary. They remain curious instead of immediately defensive. Another person believes conflict always ends in abandonment. That belief quietly influences every disagreement. They withdraw. They become suspicious. They interpret silence as rejection. Eventually, the relationship begins reflecting those patterns. The belief did not magically create the outcome. It influenced countless small decisions that gradually shaped the relationship. Our expectations often become invisible architects. The same principle appears in health. Someone who identifies as a healthy person doesn't rely entirely on motivation. Some mornings they don't feel like exercising. Some evenings they would rather eat differently. Yet their choices repeatedly align with who they believe they are becoming. Identity simplifies decisions. When behavior reflects identity consistently, discipline becomes less exhausting. The question changes from, should I do this? To, is this consistent with the person I am choosing to become? That shift may seem small, yet it changes everything. Perhaps this is why the phrase, living in the end, has survived for generations, not because it offers magical certainty, but because it invites a different relationship with the future. The future is no longer merely something that happens. It becomes something that quietly influences the choices made today. The future becomes a compass, not an escape. There is wisdom in holding a vision. There is equal wisdom in remaining grounded. Hope without action becomes fantasy. Action without direction becomes exhaustion. The challenge is learning to walk between those extremes, to hold a meaningful vision while remaining fully engaged with the work required today, to prepare without pretending, to believe without denying reality, to act consistently before results appear. That balance is far more demanding than wishful thinking. It asks us to become participants rather than spectators in our own lives. As this chapter comes to an end, another question quietly emerges. If expectations influence behavior, and behavior gradually shapes identity, then where does identity come from in the first place? Is identity something we discover, or something we continuously create? That is where our journey leads next. Chapter 2. Expectations shape decisions more than circumstances. A young woman sat outside the interview room, staring at the resume in her hands. She had spent weeks preparing. She knew the company. She understood the role. She had practiced answering difficult questions until the words came naturally. Yet as the minutes passed, another conversation quietly unfolded inside her mind. Someone else is probably more qualified. What if they realize I don't belong here? Maybe I should lower my expectations. Across the hallway sat another candidate. They weren't necessarily more talented. Their resume wasn't dramatically stronger, but the conversation taking place inside their mind sounded different. I prepared for this. I'll give them the best version of myself. Whatever happens today, I'll learn something. An hour later, both candidates left the building. One walked away convinced they had ruined the opportunity. The other walked away already thinking about the next step. The interview had ended, but the real story had begun long before either candidate entered the room. It began with expectation. People often believe circumstances determine the quality of their lives. Money, education, luck, the economy, the family they were born into. These things matter. They influence what opportunities are available and what obstacles people face. Ignoring that would oversimplify life. Yet circumstances rarely tell the whole story. What often separates people is not only what happens to them, but how they interpret what happens, and how those interpretations shape the next decision. That distinction is subtle, yet it may be one of the most important differences between people who remain stuck and those who continue growing. Expectations rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive wearing a name tag. Instead, they quietly influence countless decisions throughout the day, whether to speak up during a meeting, whether to apply for a promotion, whether to introduce yourself to someone new, whether to continue after the first setback, whether to try again after rejection. Most people assume these decisions are rational. Often, they're deeply emotional, and underneath those emotions sits an expectation. Psychologists have long studied something known as the expectancy effect. Simply put, what people expect can influence how they behave. Those behaviors then affect the outcomes they experience. The expectation itself does not magically create reality. Instead, it shapes attention, persistence, confidence, and interpretation. A student who believes improvement is possible studies differently than one who believes failure is inevitable. An athlete expecting growth trains differently from one convinced they have already reached their limit. A leader expecting solutions asks different questions than one expecting disaster. The external challenge may be identical. The internal response is not. And over months or years, those different responses begin producing different results. There's a fascinating pattern in human behavior. People usually do not rise to the level of their ambitions. They tend to behave in ways that are consistent with their expectations. Someone may dream of becoming healthier, yet if they secretly believe, "I'm simply not disciplined," their daily choices often begin confirming that belief. The dream exists. The expectation quietly overrules it. Another person may not feel exceptionally motivated either, but they expect themselves to act like someone who values health. That expectation changes small decisions. A walk after dinner, choosing water instead of another sugary drink, go to bed earlier. None of these decisions seems life-changing. Together, they become life-changing. The future is rarely transformed by one extraordinary action. It is usually shaped by thousands of ordinary choices moving in the same direction. This is why expectations deserve our attention. They influence the questions we ask ourselves. A person expecting failure asks, "Why does this always happen to me?" Someone expecting growth asks, "What can this teach me?" One question closes possibilities. The other opens them. The event hasn't changed. The conversation inside the mind has. And conversations become decisions. Consider two entrepreneurs launching nearly identical businesses. Both experience slow sales during the first 6 months. The first interprets the numbers as proof they lack ability. Every disappointing week strengthens that conclusion. Eventually, they stop experimenting. Marketing slows. Energy fades. The business quietly disappears. The second entrepreneur experiences the same disappointing numbers. The frustration is real. The uncertainty is real. But their expectation differs. They believe progress often requires adjustment rather than perfection. Instead of asking, "Why isn't this working?" they begin asking, "What haven't I learned yet?" They test new ideas, speak with customers, improve the product. Months later, the business begins growing. Observers often describe the outcome as persistence, but persistence itself was supported by expectation. The expectation didn't guarantee success. It made persistence more likely. Relationships offer another powerful example. A person who expects abandonment often notices signs that others overlook: a delayed text message, a shorter conversation, a distracted expression. None of these necessarily indicates rejection, yet expectation fills in the blanks. The mind creates a story. Behavior changes. Distance grows. Ironically, the relationship begins moving toward the very outcome that was feared, not because expectation possessed mystical power, because expectation influenced behavior. Trust weakened. Communication changed. Assumptions replace conversation. A different expectation often produces a different response. Someone expecting honesty may ask questions instead of making accusations. Someone expecting understanding may choose patience before judgment. Small differences in behavior gradually reshape the relationship itself. Sports psychologists frequently discuss mental preparation. Elite performers often rehearse situations before competition. They mentally practice difficult routines. They visualize responding calmly under pressure. This does not replace physical training. No amount of visualization teaches muscles to perform movements they have never practiced. Yet mental rehearsal helps prepare attention. It strengthens confidence. It reduces hesitation. The athlete enters competition already familiar with success in the mind, while still relying on real practice to perform in the body. Expectation becomes preparation rather than fantasy. Perhaps that distinction explains why many people misunderstand Neville Goddard. Some believe expectation should replace effort. Others reject expectation because they value effort. Reality suggests something more balanced. Healthy expectation and meaningful effort often strengthen one another. The vision guides the work. The work reinforces the vision. Attention quietly follows expectation. A person shopping for a particular car suddenly notices that model everywhere. The cars were always there. Awareness changed. The same thing happens in careers. Someone expecting opportunity begins noticing conversations worth having, skills worth learning, people worth meeting. Another person expects disappointment. Their attention naturally moves toward obstacles, dead ends, reasons not to begin. Neither person sees the entire picture. They each see what their mind considers important. Attention is selective. Expectation helps determine what gets selected. There's another reason expectations matter. They influence emotional regulation. Suppose two runners prepare for a marathon. Both experience muscle soreness during training. One interprets soreness as evidence they should stop. The other interprets soreness as a normal part of adaptation, while remaining mindful of avoiding injury. The physical sensation is similar. The meaning changes. Meaning shapes emotion. Emotion shapes behavior. Behavior shapes outcomes. This pattern repeats far beyond athletics. Every difficult conversation, every creative project, every ambitious goal, every challenge asks the same quiet question: what does this experience mean? The answer often determines what happens next. One of the greatest mistakes people make is waiting for certainty before taking action. Certainty rarely arrives first. More often, confidence grows because action creates evidence. Each completed task, each difficult conversation, each promise kept to yourself, each challenge survived, becomes another reason to expect that you can handle tomorrow. Confidence is built backwards. It is the memory of previous courage. Perhaps expectations should not be thought of as predictions. Perhaps they are directions. A compass does not guarantee calm weather. It simply helps you continue moving toward where you intend to go. Healthy expectations work the same way. They do not eliminate uncertainty. They reduce confusion. They help organize decisions around a meaningful destination. That may be the deepest misunderstanding surrounding the phrase, living in the end. The point is not pretending tomorrow has already happened. The point is allowing tomorrow to influence today's decisions, to let your future values quietly shape your present actions. By now, another realization may be emerging. If expectations quietly shape our choices, then something even deeper must shape our expectations. Where do those expectations come from? Why do two people facing similar circumstances develop completely different assumptions about themselves? And if expectations can change, can identity change as well? Chapter 3. Identity comes before achievement. There's an old photograph of a young athlete standing at the edge of a running track. Nothing about the picture suggests greatness. The stadium is nearly empty. There are no medals hanging around the athlete's neck. No cheering crowd. No headlines. No sponsorships. Just a teenager stretching quietly before another ordinary practice. Years later, after winning championships, journalists would ask, "When did you know you were going to become one of the best?" The answer surprised many people. Long before anyone else believed it, I had already started behaving like the athlete I wanted to become. Notice what wasn't said. The athlete didn't claim to know the future. There was no promise that success was guaranteed. There was simply a decision to stop acting like someone waiting for permission and begin acting like someone committed to growth. That distinction changes everything, because achievement is visible. Identity is invisible, yet the invisible often shapes the visible. Many people spend their lives chasing outcomes. I want to become successful. I want to become confident. I want to become healthy. I want to become financially free. There is nothing wrong with goals. Goals give direction. They create motivation. They remind us where we want to go. But goals have a hidden weakness. They focus almost entirely on the destination. Identity focuses on the traveler. The question changes from, "What do I want?" to, "Who am I becoming?" One question changes circumstances. The other changes character. And character has a remarkable way of influencing circumstances over time. This is where many people unknowingly create tension within themselves. They say they want success, but continue introducing themselves to the world through old identities. I've always been shy. I'm terrible with money. I'm just not disciplined. I'm the kind of person who never finishes anything. At first glance, these seem like harmless observations, but the human mind treats repeated descriptions differently. Psychologists often describe self-concept as a collection of beliefs we hold about ourselves. Those beliefs influence expectations. Expectations influence behavior. Behavior produces evidence. That evidence often strengthens the original belief. The cycle quietly repeats. Someone believes they lack confidence. Because of that belief, they avoid opportunities that require confidence. Avoiding those opportunities prevents new experiences. Without new experiences, the original belief remains unchallenged. Eventually, they conclude, "See, I knew I wasn't confident." The belief didn't create reality on its own, but it influenced enough decisions to make the belief feel increasingly true. There is an interesting paradox in human behavior. People often become extremely loyal, not to happiness, but to identity, even when that identity no longer serves them. A person may complain about procrastination for years, yet if they secretly believe, "I've always been a procrastinator," every delay feels strangely familiar. Changing behavior would require changing the story, and changing the story can feel unsettling. The brain often prefers familiar discomfort over unfamiliar possibility, not because it wants you to suffer, because familiarity has historically signaled safety. Your mind evolved to recognize patterns. It wasn't designed primarily to maximize achievement. It was designed to help you survive. That difference explains why growth often feels uncomfortable. The unfamiliar always asks more of us. Consider a musician preparing for a concert. Months before stepping onto the stage, something begins changing. Daily routines become more intentional. Practice becomes consistent. Sleep becomes more important. Distractions become easier to decline. Why? Because the musician is no longer asking, "Should I practice today?" They're operating from a different identity. This is what musicians do. Notice how powerful that shift is. Discipline becomes less about forcing yourself and more about remaining consistent with who you believe you are. Identity quietly simplifies decision-making. This idea appears throughout everyday life. Someone who identifies as a reader naturally picks up books. Someone who identifies as a runner eventually runs, even on days when motivation disappears. Someone who identifies as a reliable friend returns phone calls, keeps promises, and shows up when needed. Their actions are not perfect. No one behaves consistently all the time, but over months and years, identity gently pulls behavior back toward itself. This is why lasting habits often begin with identity rather than willpower. The question isn't, how can I force myself to exercise? A more interesting question might be, what kind of person naturally values movement? The behavior follows a belief more often than we realize. Modern psychology supports part of this picture. Researchers studying identity-based behavior have found that people are often more likely to maintain habits when those habits align with how they see themselves. If a behavior feels connected to identity, consistency becomes easier. This doesn't mean identity is fixed. Quite the opposite. Identity evolves through repeated experiences. Every promise you keep to yourself becomes evidence. Every difficult conversation you choose to have becomes evidence. Every challenge you face honestly becomes evidence. Slowly, the mind begins updating its internal picture. Perhaps I am more resilient than I believed. Perhaps I am capable of learning. Perhaps I can change. Identity shifts gradually, not through one extraordinary moment, but through accumulated proof. This helps explain why many people struggle with positive affirmations. If someone deeply believes, I'm incapable, repeating, I'm unstoppable, may create internal conflict rather than confidence. The mind compares a statement against years of accumulated evidence. The gap feels too large. Growth often begins more realistically, not by declaring perfection, but by creating believable progress. I'm becoming more disciplined. I'm learning to communicate better. I'm practicing courage. These statements leave room for development. They invite action. Identity grows strongest when words and behavior support one another. Careers provide another example. Two employees begin the same position on the same day. Both possess similar qualifications. One quietly thinks, I'm here to learn. The other thinks, I hope nobody realizes I don't belong. Months pass. The first employee volunteers for projects, asks thoughtful questions, accepts feedback. The second avoids visibility, stays silent, interprets constructive criticism as personal failure. Years later, observers notice different careers, promotions, leadership, confidence. It appears as though circumstances created the difference. Yet, much of the difference began with identity. Identity influenced attention. Attention influenced behavior. Behavior influenced opportunity. Opportunity influenced achievement. Achievement reinforced identity. The cycle continued. Creative work follows the same principle. Many people dream of writing a book. Very few consistently write. Why? Because wishing to become a writer is different from identifying as someone who writes. Writers don't wait for inspiration every morning. Sometimes inspiration arrives after the work begins. The identity comes first. The routine follows. Eventually, the pages accumulate. The book appears. Outsiders call it talent. The writer remembers ordinary mornings spent sitting quietly in front of blank pages. Achievement often hides years of invisible identity. Health tells a similar story. Someone trying to lose weight may ask, what diet should I follow? A different question changes everything. What choices would someone who genuinely values their health make today? Notice the difference. One question searches for temporary rules. The other develops lasting identity. Healthy people still eat dessert. Athletes still miss workouts. Writers still experience creative blocks. Identity does not require perfection. It requires direction. It provides a compass, not a prison. This perspective also changes how we think about failure. If identity depends entirely upon achievement, every setback threatens self-worth. Lose the race, you become a loser. Lose the job, you become unsuccessful. End the relationship, you become unlovable. But if identity is rooted in values rather than temporary outcomes, failure becomes information, not definition. The entrepreneur whose business struggles remains someone committed to learning. The athlete recovering from injury remains an athlete. The artist rejected by publishers remains an artist. Circumstances change. Identity remains anchored. That stability creates resilience. Perhaps this explains why Neville Goddard's ideas continue to generate discussion decades later. Whether one approaches them through philosophy, spirituality, or psychology, they repeatedly invite attention toward identity. Not merely what life looks like, but who you believe yourself to be while living it. Modern psychology arrives at a similar practical insight from a different direction. Self-concept matters. Identity matters. The stories people believe about themselves influence the choices they repeatedly make. Those choices influence outcomes. Outcomes reshape identity. Neither perspective suggests that identity alone guarantees external success. Life remains unpredictable. Opportunity remains uneven. Circumstances remain real. Yet within those realities, identity quietly influences the way we respond, and response often determines the next chapter of our lives. As this chapter draws to a close, another question quietly emerges. If identity shapes behavior, and behavior gradually reinforces identity, then where does the image of our future self come from? How do people begin acting like someone they have not yet become? Perhaps the answer lies in one of the mind's most remarkable abilities, its capacity to rehearse tomorrow before tomorrow arrives. Chapter 4. Imagination as Mental Rehearsal. What is the purpose of imagination? Most people answer that question without ever truly asking it. Some think imagination belongs to children. Others associate it with artists, novelists, filmmakers, or dreamers. Many see it as an escape from reality, a pleasant place the mind visits when reality becomes too ordinary. Yet if imagination were nothing more than entertainment, why would the human brain devote so much energy to it? Why can you mentally rehearse a difficult conversation before it happens? Why can you anticipate tomorrow's challenges before tomorrow arrives? Why can a pianist silently move through an entire concerto without touching a single key? Why can an athlete feel nervous about a race that hasn't begun? Perhaps imagination is not merely a place we escape to. Perhaps it is one of the primary ways the mind prepares for reality. That possibility changes everything. Throughout history, philosophers have described human beings as creatures who live twice. The first life unfolds within thought. The second unfolds through action. Before a bridge exists, someone first conceives its structure. Before a scientific discovery changes the world, someone entertains a possibility that others cannot yet see. Before an entrepreneur builds a company, countless invisible decisions occur in the mind. Civilizations are built externally, but they begin internally. The same is true for individual lives. Every decision begins as an internal event before it becomes an external one. This does not mean thoughts magically create reality. Reality is shaped by countless influences beyond our control. But thoughts influence attention. Attention influences decisions. Decisions influence behavior. Behavior, repeated consistently, shapes the direction of a life. Imagination occupies the very beginning of that chain. One of the greatest misunderstandings surrounding imagination is the belief that it exists to predict the future. Perhaps its greater purpose is to prepare us for it. Modern psychology offers fascinating insight into this idea. Researchers have spent decades studying mental rehearsal, the practice of vividly practicing an action in the mind before performing it in the real world. Elite athletes have used it for generations. Olympic skiers mentally descend courses before the race begins. Professional golfers rehearse each swing internally before stepping toward the ball. Musicians silently perform entire concerts while sitting in complete stillness. This mental practice does not replace physical training. No amount of visualization alone teaches someone to swim, speak a new language, or perform surgery. Yet when mental rehearsal accompanies deliberate practice, it can improve confidence, focus, and readiness because the brain is preparing for situations before they unfold. The mind is not confusing fantasy with reality. It is reducing uncertainty through preparation. That distinction matters. Consider how often your imagination already influences your life. Before making a difficult phone call, your mind quietly rehearses possible responses. Before walking into an interview, you picture the room. Before proposing a new idea at work, you anticipate questions your colleagues might ask. This happens almost automatically. The remarkable thing is that imagination itself is neutral. It serves whatever direction we repeatedly give it. Some people rehearse success. Others rehearse failure. Some mentally prepare for opportunities. Others mentally prepare for disappointment. The same extraordinary ability is being used in opposite directions. The imagination is not the problem. The pattern of rehearsal often is. There's another reason this matters. Your brain does not simply record experience. It constantly predicts experience. Neuroscientists describe the brain as a prediction-making organ based on previous experiences. It continuously forms expectations about what is likely to happen next. Those predictions help you navigate the world efficiently. They also influence how you interpret what you encounter. If you expect rejection, ambiguous situations may feel more threatening. If you expect growth, challenges may appear more manageable. Imagination quietly contributes to those expectations by repeatedly presenting the mind with possible futures. Every rehearsal strengthens familiarity. Every familiar pathway becomes easier to access again. This is one reason recurring thoughts often feel increasingly believable, not because they are objectively true, but because they have become mentally well-practiced. This raises an important question. If the mind is constantly rehearsing, who is directing the rehearsal? Most people never consciously decide. The rehearsal simply happens. Yesterday's fears become tomorrow's expectations. Old disappointments become future assumptions. The mind repeatedly screens the same internal film until it begins to mistake repetition for probability. This is where awareness becomes valuable, not because awareness eliminates uncertainty, but because awareness allows us to choose what deserves repeated attention. Neville Goddard encouraged people to think carefully about the relationship between imagination and experience. Whether one interprets his ideas spiritually or psychologically, one principle remains particularly interesting. He repeatedly invited people to become conscious participants in their inner lives instead of passive observers. Modern psychology reaches a similar practical conclusion through a different path. People who intentionally reflect upon their thinking are often better positioned to interrupt automatic patterns than those who never notice them. The explanation differs. The practical invitation is surprisingly similar. Become aware of the conversation occurring inside your own mind. Creativity provides another window into this discussion. Every invention exists twice. First as possibility, then as reality. A composer hears music before anyone else hears it. An architect walks through a building years before it stands. A filmmaker sees scenes long before cameras begin rolling. Their imagination does not construct the final product. It guides the countless decisions required to create it. Vision precedes execution. Execution refines vision. Each depends upon the other. Without imagination, there is no direction. Without action, there is no completion. This principle appears in ordinary life just as clearly. Someone preparing for an important conversation often thinks through several approaches before speaking. A parent considers how to respond calmly during a child's difficult moment. A physician mentally reviews procedures before entering an operating room. A teacher rehearses the first lesson before students arrive. None of these people are escaping reality. They are becoming more prepared to meet it. Perhaps imagination reaches its highest purpose when it serves preparation rather than avoidance. There is also a danger worth acknowledging. Imagination can become an endless substitute for action. Some people become experts at planning, experts at visualizing, experts at consuming information. Years pass while real decisions remain postponed. This is not imagination fulfilling its purpose. It is imagination replacing responsibility. A map becomes useless if no journey ever begins. Likewise, an inspiring vision remains incomplete until it influences today's choices. This may be one of the greatest lessons hidden beneath discussions of visualization. The goal is not to admire the destination. The goal is to become the kind of person who walks toward it. Attention quietly determines whether imagination becomes constructive or destructive. Two people preparing for the same presentation may spend the evening thinking. One repeatedly rehearses forgetting every sentence. The other rehearses explaining one idea clearly before moving to the next. Neither controls tomorrow completely, but each is strengthening different expectations. Those expectations influence emotional regulation. They influence breathing, body language, confidence, persistence after small mistakes. Again, Imagination is not creating certainty. It is influencing readiness. Perhaps this explains why identity, expectation, and imagination are so deeply connected. Identity influences what we naturally imagine. Imagination reinforces expectation. Expectation shapes behavior. Behavior strengthens identity. The cycle continues. Changing one part of the system gradually influences the others. Not instantly, not magically, gradually, like a river carving stone through patient repetition. Many people spend years asking, how do I become successful? Perhaps a more interesting question is, what future am I rehearsing every day? Not only through formal visualization, but through ordinary thinking. What conversations do you replay? What possibilities do you dismiss before they have a chance to grow? What assumptions quietly shape tomorrow before tomorrow arrives? These questions reveal that imagination is not reserved for extraordinary people. It accompanies every human being. The difference lies in whether it is being used consciously or automatically. As this chapter comes to a close, another question naturally emerges. If imagination prepares the mind, then what separates healthy expectation from mere wishful thinking? At what point does hope become an assumption? And why do those two ideas, though often confused, lead people toward entirely different ways of living? That is where our journey continues next. Chapter 5. The difference between hope and assumption. Hope has inspired revolutions, carried people through unimaginable hardship, and kept countless dreams alive when circumstances suggested otherwise. There is something deeply human about hope. It allows people to look beyond present difficulty and believe that tomorrow can be different from today. Yet hope has an interesting limitation. Hope often lives in the future. It whispers, maybe one day, perhaps things will improve. I hope everything works out. There is nothing wrong with those words. The problem is that they often leave the present untouched. A person can hope for years without changing the decisions that shape tomorrow. That raises an important question. If hope alone were enough, why do so many intelligent, hard-working people remain trapped in patterns they desperately want to escape? Perhaps because hope and assumption are not the same thing, and confusing the two changes the direction of an entire life. Language quietly reveals the architecture of the mind. Listen carefully to how people describe their future. I hope I become successful. I hope someone notices my work. I hope this relationship improves. I hope I become healthier. Hope often places life at a distance. It positions change as something that may arrive from outside ourselves. Assumption speaks differently, not because it claims certainty about the future, but because it changes the relationship with the present. Instead of asking, will this happen? Assumption begins asking, if I genuinely believe this future was worth preparing for, what would I do today? That single shift changes behavior, and behavior changes trajectories. There is an important philosophical distinction hidden here. Hope is frequently emotional. Assumption is behavioral. Hope asks life for permission. Assumption begins preparing. A farmer does not wait until the harvest appears before planting seeds. An architect does not wait for a building to exist before drawing plans. A musician does not wait to become extraordinary before practicing scales. Preparation itself becomes evidence of belief. Not belief that success is guaranteed. Belief that today's effort deserves tomorrow's opportunity. That difference may sound subtle. In reality, it separates dreaming from deliberate action. Psychology offers an interesting perspective on this idea. Researchers have long observed that expectations influence persistence. When people believe that sustained effort can produce meaningful progress, they are generally more willing to continue through setbacks. This does not mean expectations determine outcomes. Reality remains unpredictable. Markets change. Relationships evolve. Health fluctuates. Unexpected events interrupt carefully designed plans. Yet expectations influence something remarkably important, whether people remain engaged long enough to discover what is possible. Hope may encourage someone to begin. Expectation often helps them continue. Many people unknowingly place their lives on pause. They tell themselves, once I feel confident, once I have enough money, once someone believes in me, once circumstances improve, only then will they begin. The difficulty is that confidence rarely arrives before action. Confidence often grows because of action. The entrepreneur becomes more confident after solving difficult problems. The public speaker becomes more confident after delivering many presentations. The writer becomes more confident after finishing chapters that once seemed impossible. Experience gradually produces evidence. Evidence strengthens expectation. Expectation changes identity. The process works from the inside outward, not because reality bends itself to belief, but because belief changes participation. This is where one of Neville Goddard's most discussed ideas deserves careful interpretation. Many readers hear the phrase, assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, and conclude that it means pretending reality has already changed. Perhaps there is another way to understand it. Suppose assumption is less about convincing yourself that tomorrow already exists and more about refusing to let today's limitations become tomorrow's identity. There's profound wisdom in that distinction. The future remains uncertain. The person preparing for it does not remain passive. Consider the difference between two medical students preparing for their licensing examinations. Both feel nervous. Both understand the challenge ahead. The first student repeatedly thinks, I hope I pass. The second thinks, passing will require disciplined preparation, and that is exactly what I intend to give. Notice that neither student possesses certainty. Neither controls the examination. Neither knows the outcome. Yet their assumptions influence today's behavior. One studies when motivation appears. The other studies because preparation has become part of who they are choosing to become. The examination remains months away. Identity begins changing today. Human beings often mistake emotion for commitment. Feeling inspired is not the same as becoming committed. Motivation rises and falls like weather. Identity remains far more stable. Someone who sees themselves as a lifelong learner continues reading when inspiration disappears. Someone who identifies as an athlete trains on ordinary mornings. Someone committed to meaningful relationships apologizes even when pride argues otherwise. Their assumptions have become integrated into daily behavior. They no longer depend entirely upon emotion. This explains why habits deserve so much attention. Habits are assumptions made visible. Every repeated action quietly answers the question, what kind of person do I believe I am? The person who consistently arrives early communicates something about responsibility. The person who continually postpones important conversations communicates something about avoidance. Not because either action permanently defines them, but because repeated behaviors gradually strengthen identity. The fascinating part is that habits are often too small to notice while they are being formed. Yet years later, they become impossible to ignore. Attention also plays an important role. Hope often focuses on outcomes. Assumption pays closer attention to process. An artist who obsesses over becoming famous may struggle to create consistently. Another artist becomes fascinated by improving one painting at a time. One pays attention to applause. The other pays attention to craftsmanship. Ironically, craftsmanship is often what eventually attracts applause. This pattern appears everywhere. The best entrepreneurs frequently become absorbed by solving problems rather than chasing status. Exceptional athletes become absorbed by mastering fundamentals rather than merely dreaming about trophies. Attention quietly reveals assumption. Where attention goes, behavior follows. There is another misunderstanding worth exploring. Some people believe assumption means ignoring fear. It does not. Fear remains one of the most natural human emotions. Every meaningful journey includes uncertainty. The difference lies in what fear is allowed to decide. A surgeon may feel nervous before a difficult operation. A pilot remains alert before takeoff. A business owner worries about important decisions. Courage does not eliminate fear. Courage changes the relationship with fear. The assumption becomes, fear may accompany me, but it does not have to lead me. That perspective creates emotional regulation rather than emotional suppression. Philosophers have long observed that people become what they repeatedly practice. Not occasionally, repeatedly. Character is not revealed by extraordinary moments alone. It is shaped by ordinary decisions made when nobody is watching. Integrity develops quietly. Discipline develops quietly. Compassion develops quietly. So does wisdom. Perhaps assumption is simply the quiet decision to practice the qualities your future acquires before external recognition arrives. Recognition becomes a consequence, not the starting point. This way of thinking transforms disappointment. A setback no longer becomes proof that hope was misplaced. Instead, it becomes information. Athletes review mistakes after competition. Scientists revise hypotheses. Entrepreneurs adapt strategies. None of these responses guarantee success, but they preserve something far more valuable than certainty. They preserve movement. Life rarely rewards perfect plans. It often rewards thoughtful adaptation. There's a remarkable difference between people who continually grow and those who gradually stop. The difference is not always intelligence, nor opportunity. Often it is the assumptions they carry into ordinary days. One assumes learning never ends. Another assumes ability is fixed. One assumes difficult conversations strengthen relationships. Another assumes conflict should always be avoided. One assumes mistakes contain lessons. Another assumes mistakes reveal permanent inadequacy. These assumptions quietly shape lives without announcing themselves. Perhaps this is why the relationship between hope and assumption deserves careful attention. Hope looks toward tomorrow. Assumption asks something of today. Hope inspires. Assumption prepares. Hope dreams. Assumption practices. Neither is complete without the other. Hope without preparation becomes fantasy. Preparation without hope becomes mechanical. When they work together, they create something far more powerful, purposeful action. As we move toward the next chapter, another question naturally emerges. If assumptions quietly influence identity, and identity shapes behavior, why do so many people spend years waiting before they finally begin? What keeps intelligent, capable individuals standing at the edge of change, even when they know exactly where they want to go? That hesitation reveals another invisible force, one that quietly delays countless lives without ever announcing its presence. Chapter 6. Why most people keep waiting. What are people actually waiting for? At first, the answer seems obvious. Money, the right opportunity, better timing, more knowledge, more confidence, a better economy, a healthier body, a stronger network, a little more experience, a little more certainty. But if you listen closely, something interesting begins to emerge. The object of waiting changes from person to person, yet the habit of waiting remains remarkably constant. One person waits until they finish university. Another waits until they receive a promotion. Someone else waits until the children are older. Another waits until retirement. Others wait until they feel inspired. Then one day, they realize they become experts at preparing for a life they never actually started. Perhaps the greatest delay in life is not caused by circumstances. Perhaps it is caused by the quiet belief that the present is never enough to begin. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard once suggested that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. That sentence deserves careful attention. Most people assume they fear failure. Often, what they truly fear is responsibility. Because genuine freedom comes with an uncomfortable realization. If you are free to choose, then you are also responsible for choosing. Waiting becomes psychologically attractive because it postpones responsibility. As long as tomorrow remains a starting point, today cannot disappoint you. Tomorrow becomes a place where dreams remain perfect because they have never encountered reality. Reality asks something much more demanding. It asks for action. One of the mind's most remarkable abilities is its capacity to create convincing reasons. Rarely do people say, "I'm avoiding this because I'm afraid." Instead, fear often disguises itself as logic. "I just need a little more research. The timing isn't right. I'll begin when things calm down. I need one more course. Next month will be better." Sometimes those reasons are valid. Preparation matters. Education matters. Timing matters. But there is a subtle point where preparation quietly transforms into postponement. The difficult part is that both can look almost identical from the outside. Only honesty reveals the difference. Preparation moves you closer to action. Avoidance keeps moving the starting line. Psychologists describe a phenomenon known as analysis paralysis. When faced with too many choices or too much uncertainty, people often make no decision at all. from an evolutionary perspective, hesitation sometimes protected survival. A rushed decision in a dangerous environment could have serious consequences. The modern world, however, often rewards thoughtful action more than endless hesitation. The entrepreneur who waits for the perfect business plan may never launch. The writer who waits for a perfect inspiration may never finish a chapter. The athlete waiting to feel fully prepared may never enter the competition. Perfection quietly becomes another name for delay. This is why certainty is such a fascinating illusion. People believe certainty exists somewhere in the future. Once I know enough, once I'm completely ready, once I eliminate every risk. Yet certainty rarely arrives. The physician still encounters unfamiliar cases. The pilot still faces unexpected weather. The entrepreneur still makes decisions with incomplete information. The parent still wonders whether they are making the right choice. Life continues asking questions that cannot be answered in advance. Wisdom is not eliminating uncertainty. Wisdom is learning to move responsibly despite it. There is an interesting relationship between waiting and identity. Every time people postpone an important decision, they quietly reinforce an existing self-concept. Someone who repeatedly delays speaking in meetings slowly strengthens the identity of being silent. Someone postponing difficult conversations strengthens avoidance. Someone delaying creative work reinforces the belief, I'm someone who never follows through. The delay itself becomes evidence, not because postponement defines a person forever, but because repeated behavior gradually becomes self-description. Identity is constantly collecting proof. Whether that proof is intentional or accidental depends upon awareness. Many discussions about motivation begin in the wrong place. They assume people need stronger emotions, more inspiration, more excitement. Yet motivation is remarkably unstable. Some mornings enthusiasm arrives effortlessly. Other mornings it disappears without explanation. If action depends entirely upon motivation, consistency becomes impossible. This is one reason habits become so valuable. Habits reduce negotiation. The decision has already been made. The runner puts on their shoes. The musician begins practicing. The reader opens a book. Not because every day feels extraordinary, but because repetition has become normal. Waiting often disappears when routine replaces debate. The ancient Stoic philosophers made an observation that feels surprisingly modern. They argued that much human suffering comes from attempting to control what cannot be controlled while neglecting what can. Waiting frequently reverses this principle. People wait for confidence, an emotion they cannot fully command. Instead of strengthening discipline, a behavior they can practice, they wait for fear to disappear. Instead of learning to act alongside fear, they wait for perfect circumstances. Instead of improving their preparation within imperfect circumstances, the focus quietly shifts away from agency, not because circumstances do not matter. They certainly do, but because meaningful progress often begins where influence is still possible. Careers provide an excellent illustration. Two graduates enter the workforce with similar qualifications. One spends years waiting to feel ready before accepting leadership opportunities. The other accepts that readiness is often developed through responsibility rather than before it. Neither person possesses certainty. One simply chooses to let experience become the teacher. Years later, observers call the second individual confident. Confidence was not the prerequisite. It became the consequence. The same principle appears in relationships. Many people postpone honest conversations because they hope discomfort will disappear on its own. Sometimes silence feels safer than vulnerability, yet silence rarely resolves misunderstanding. Instead, distance quietly grows. Relationships are often shaped less by dramatic moments than by conversations that never happened. Waiting becomes its own decision. Not speaking is still a form of speaking. Choosing nothing is still a choice. Life continues moving whether decisions are made consciously or unconsciously. There is another reason people keep waiting. They confuse readiness with comfort. These are not the same thing. Readiness often includes discomfort. The first public speech feels uncomfortable. The first day in a new position feels uncomfortable. Starting a business feels uncomfortable. Publishing creative work feels uncomfortable. Discomfort is frequently interpreted as evidence that something is wrong. Sometimes it simply signals that something is unfamiliar. Growth rarely announces itself through ease. More often, it introduces itself through uncertainty. Modern neuroscience reminds us that the brain values prediction. Familiar routines require less energy than unfamiliar ones. This helps explain why old habits feel effortless, while new habits require conscious attention. Waiting often becomes the brain's attempt to preserve predictability. The unknown demands more effort. The familiar asks very little. Understanding this does not eliminate resistance. It helps explain why resistance appears. Once understood, resistance becomes less intimidating. It is no longer proof that you are incapable. It is often evidence that you are entering unfamiliar territory. Perhaps the deepest insight is this: life is not divided into people who are ready and people who are not. It is divided into people who begin before they feel fully prepared, and those who continue waiting for a feeling that rarely arrives. The difference between them is rarely talent, rarely intelligence, rarely opportunity alone. It is often the willingness to accept that clarity grows through movement, not before movement. A ship cannot discover new horizons while remaining permanently anchored. The anchor provides safety. It was never meant to become a permanent home. This may be one of the most practical ways to understand Neville Goddard's emphasis on assumption. Whether viewed philosophically or psychologically, assumption is less about predicting tomorrow and more about refusing to postpone today's participation in the life you hope to build. Preparation begins now. Learning begins now. Discipline begins now. Not because success is guaranteed, but because the future is always influenced by what repeatedly happens in the present. As this chapter closes, another question quietly rises beneath everything we have explored. If waiting is often sustained by the stories people believe about themselves, then what exactly is the nature of that story? How does a person's self-concept become so powerful that it can quietly shape years of decisions, often without them ever noticing? That question leads us to perhaps the most influential force in human behavior, the psychology of self-concept. Chapter 7. The Psychology of Self-Concept. Who are you? At first, the question appears simple. Most people answer with a name, a profession, an age, a nationality, or perhaps a list of achievements. But none of those things truly answers the question. A profession can change. Money can disappear. Relationships evolve. Health rises and falls. Even personality shifts throughout life. So beneath all of those changing circumstances lies a deeper question. Who is the person making every decision in your life? That question points towards something psychologists often call self-concept. Self-concept is not who you truly are in every possible sense. It is the picture your mind has created about who you believe yourself to be. And that picture quietly influences almost everything. Most people spend years trying to change their circumstances while leaving their self-concept untouched. They pursue promotions without believing they deserve leadership. They seek healthy relationships while secretly believing they are difficult to love. They pursue financial freedom while carrying an internal belief that wealth belongs to someone else. From the outside, these goals appear logical. Internally, however, there is conflict. The mind naturally seeks consistency. When behavior and identity disagree, tension appears. That tension explains why lasting change often feels more difficult than expected. The greatest obstacle is rarely external. It is the invisible conversation between behavior and identity. One of the most fascinating characteristics of the human mind is that it prefers consistency over contradiction. People generally behave in ways that reinforce the person they already believe themselves to be. Not because they consciously choose to, but because consistency creates psychological stability. A person who believes they are dependable feels uncomfortable breaking promises. Someone who believes they are disorganized often behaves in ways that reinforce that description. This tendency has been observed repeatedly in psychological research. Identity becomes a reference point. Behavior gradually moves toward that reference. Not perfectly, but consistently enough to shape an entire life. This explains why changing habits can feel surprisingly difficult. The challenge is rarely the habit itself. The challenge is what the habit represents. Suppose someone has smoked cigarettes for 20 years. Stopping smoking is not merely removing nicotine. It may also require changing a long-held identity. If smoking became part of how they socialized, how they handled stress, how they described themselves, then quitting affects far more than behavior. It affects self-concept. Until identity begins changing, the old behavior often continues calling the person back. This is true far beyond addiction. Every lasting habit eventually becomes part of the answer to the question, who am I? Philosophers have wrestled with identity for thousands of years. Heraclitus observed that no person steps into the same river twice. The river changes. The person changes. Modern psychology reaches a surprisingly similar conclusion. The self is not a fixed object. It is continuously developing through experience, memory, relationships, and repeated action. Yet the mind often resists this reality. It prefers permanence. It likes stable categories. I'm an introvert. I'm bad with money. I'm naturally confident. I'm just not creative. These labels simplify a complicated world, but they also carry a hidden cost. They encourage us to mistake temporary patterns for permanent truths. There's a profound difference between describing a behavior and describing an identity. I made a mistake, and I am a failure. One statement refers to an event. The other attempts to define an entire person. The first leaves room for growth. The second quietly closes the door. Language matters because language influences perception. Perception influences behavior. Behavior gradually strengthens identity. This cycle often unfolds so slowly that people mistake it for fate. Consider someone learning to play the piano. During the first months, mistakes happen constantly. Wrong notes, poor timing, frustration, slow progress. If every mistake becomes evidence that they lack talent, many people eventually stop. Another learner experiences exactly the same difficulties, but interprets them differently. This is what learning sounds like. The notes remain identical. The interpretation changes. One person protects identity by avoiding challenge. The other allows identity to expand through challenge. Over time, their futures begin separating, not because one encountered less difficulty, but because one allowed difficulty to reshape self-concept rather than destroy it. Self-concept also influences attention. The brain constantly filters enormous amounts of information. Only a small fraction reaches conscious awareness. What determines that filter? Part of the answer is relevance. Part is expectation. Part is identity. Someone who identifies as a business owner notices opportunities others ignore. A scientist notices patterns others overlook. A musician hears details that escape an untrained ear. Identity quietly teaches attention what deserves notice. In that sense, identity shapes perception long before it shapes achievement. You cannot consistently pursue what you fail to notice. There is another psychological principle worth considering. People naturally seek evidence that confirms existing beliefs. This tendency, often called confirmation bias, influences everyone. If someone believes they are respected, they may notice encouragement more readily than criticism. If someone believes they are constantly overlooked, they may remember rejection while overlooking appreciation. Reality is often more balanced than either interpretation. The mind simply highlights information consistent with its existing model. This does not mean people consciously distort reality. It means perception is never completely neutral. Self-concept quietly influences what appears meaningful. Perhaps this explains why external success does not always produce internal confidence. History is filled with accomplished individuals who privately believed they were frauds. Recognition changed. Identity did not. Their achievements grew faster than their self-concept. The opposite can also occur. Someone with very little external recognition may carry deep confidence rooted in competence and preparation. Their identity remains stable even while circumstances fluctuate. This reminds us that achievement and self-concept are related, but they are not identical. External success cannot permanently solve an internal identity conflict. This perspective changes how we think about confidence. Confidence is often mistaken for certainty. In reality, healthy confidence may simply be trust in one's ability to learn. A surgeon does not know exactly how every operation will unfold. An entrepreneur cannot predict every market change. A teacher cannot anticipate every student's question. Confidence grows not because uncertainty disappears, but because experience repeatedly demonstrates. Whatever happens, I can continue learning. That belief creates psychological resilience. Self-concept becomes flexible rather than fragile. Neville Goddard repeatedly encouraged people to examine the assumptions they held about themselves. Whether one interprets his ideas philosophically or spiritually, the practical invitation remains thought-provoking. What internal identity quietly governs your choices? Modern psychology approaches the same question differently. It asks how beliefs about oneself influence behavior, attention, emotional regulation, and persistence. The vocabulary differs. The curiosity is remarkably similar. Both perspectives encourage greater awareness of the internal story. Awareness, however, is only the beginning. Awareness without action becomes another interesting idea. The real challenge is allowing new experiences to gradually reshape identity. Each promise kept, each difficult conversation completed, each healthy decision repeated, each courageous act performed despite uncertainty. These moments become evidence. Evidence reshapes belief. Belief reshapes self-concept. The process rarely happens overnight. Identity develops the same way mountains are carved by rivers. Quietly, patiently, consistently. There's a reason lasting transformation often feels surprisingly ordinary. People expect dramatic breakthroughs. Life more often changes through accumulated evidence. One workout does not create health. One chapter does not create a book. One conversation does not create trust. One decision does not create wisdom. Yet repeated choices quietly become character. Character becomes identity. Identity begins influencing every future decision. This is why ordinary days deserve extraordinary respect. Most lives are built there. Perhaps the most liberating realization is that self-concept is neither a prison nor a fantasy. It is a working model. And like every useful model, it can be revised when new evidence appears. You are not required to remain loyal to every story your past has written. You are allowed to update the picture, not through denial, not through wishful thinking, but through repeated action that gradually makes a new identity believable. As this chapter comes to a close, another question quietly appears. If self-concept shapes how we think, how we notice, and how we behave, then what happens when our daily actions finally begin aligning with the person we hope to become? At what point does identity stop feeling like aspiration and begin feeling like reality? That question leads us into the next chapter, where philosophy meets practice and thought becomes action. Chapter 8. Acting in alignment with your future self. Every human being is constantly moving toward a future. Whether that future is consciously chosen or unconsciously repeated is another matter entirely. Most people think the future arrives one day at a time. In reality, much of tomorrow is quietly rehearsed through today's decisions. Not because life is predetermined, not because success is guaranteed, but because every repeated action strengthens a particular direction. Direction matters far more than many people realize. A compass does not instantly transport a traveler to their destination. It simply ensures that every step moves toward the same horizon. Life works in much the same way. The greatest transformations rarely happen because of one extraordinary decision. They happen because thousands of ordinary decisions gradually begin pointing in the same direction. That is what it means to live in alignment. One of the greatest misconceptions about personal growth is the belief that action follows certainty. People often say, once I become confident, I'll speak up. Once I feel disciplined, I'll exercise consistently. Once I believe in myself, I'll finally start. Yet life repeatedly demonstrates the opposite. Confidence often follows action. Discipline follows repetition. Belief grows from evidence. The person waiting for these qualities before acting frequently remains exactly where they are. The person willing to act imperfectly begins collecting experiences that slowly reshape identity. Action is not merely an expression of identity. It is one of identity's greatest teachers. There is an interesting difference between wishing for a future and preparing for one. Wishing asks, what if? Preparation quietly asks, what needs to happen today? One remains largely emotional. The other becomes practical. This distinction appears everywhere. An aspiring author dreams about publishing a book. A working author writes even when inspiration is absent. A person who hopes to become financially stable thinks about money. Someone preparing for financial stability develops habits around saving, learning, budgeting, and thoughtful decision-making. The difference is rarely found in desire. It is found in alignment. Alignment means allowing today's behavior to reflect tomorrow's values. Philosophers have long suggested that character is revealed through repeated action rather than isolated intention. Aristotle observed that excellence is not an act but a habit. Modern behavioral science reaches a remarkably similar conclusion through different language. Repeated behaviors gradually strengthen neural pathways, making future behaviors easier to repeat. Every decision becomes both an action and a rehearsal. The brain is constantly learning from what you repeatedly do, not from what you occasionally promise. This explains why intentions alone rarely transform lives. The mind pays closer attention to repeated evidence than temporary enthusiasm. Consider how often people negotiate with themselves. I'll start on Monday. I'll exercise tomorrow. I'll apologize when the timing feels better. I'll apply next month. Each decision appears small, almost insignificant. Yet every postponed action quietly teaches the brain something. Sometimes it teaches patience. Sometimes it teaches avoidance. The brain does not simply remember what you say. It remembers what you repeatedly practice. Identity grows from practice far more reliably than from intention. There is another psychological principle quietly operating beneath this process. People naturally seek consistency between their beliefs and their actions. When those two conflict, discomfort appears. Psychologists often describe this as cognitive dissonance. Suppose someone believes they value health, yet every daily decision contradicts that belief. Eventually something changes. Either behavior begins aligning with identity, or identity quietly adjusts itself to justify the behavior. Human beings are remarkably creative when protecting internal consistency. That is why alignment matters. It reduces unnecessary conflict between what we believe and what we repeatedly do. Careers offer a practical illustration. Many professionals ask themselves, how do I become a leader? A more revealing question might be, what does leadership require before promotion arrives? Leadership is rarely created by the title itself. Titles often recognize behaviors that have already been practiced. Taking responsibility, communicating clearly, helping others succeed, remaining calm under pressure, making thoughtful decisions. These qualities often begin long before external recognition appears. Promotion becomes confirmation, not transformation. The same principle applies to creativity. Many people dream about becoming artists, writers, musicians, or filmmakers. Yet creative identity is strengthened through creation itself. A blank page does not care whether someone feels inspired. A piano does not respond to future intentions. A camera does not reward delayed commitment. Creative work asks one simple question each day. Will you show up? Consistency quietly answers. Relationships reveal perhaps the most human expression of alignment. People often describe love as a feeling. Feelings matter, but relationships survive because of repeated behavior. Listening, honesty, kindness, forgiveness, attention. Trust grows when these actions become consistent, not because anyone performs them perfectly, but because they become part of the relationship's identity. The strongest relationships are rarely built by extraordinary moments alone. They are strengthened through ordinary days lived with care. Health follows the same pattern. Someone hoping to become healthier often focuses on dramatic changes, a perfect diet, an ambitious exercise program, an entirely new lifestyle. Yet sustainable transformation usually develops differently. One meal, one walk, one night's sleep, one decision repeated again tomorrow. Tiny actions rarely look impressive in isolation. Compounded over years, they become almost impossible to ignore. The future is often hidden inside ordinary routines. Sports psychology provides another fascinating example. Elite performers rarely prepare only for victory. They prepare for difficulty. They rehearse recovering after mistakes, remaining composed under pressure, adjusting after setbacks. This creates emotional flexibility, rather than emotional fragility. Preparation includes adversity because adversity belongs to every meaningful journey. Perhaps this is another lesson hidden beneath Neville Goddard's philosophy. The future is not rehearsed by pretending obstacles disappear. It is rehearsed by becoming the kind of person capable of meeting those obstacles wisely. That interpretation aligns remarkably well with modern psychology. Mental rehearsal strengthens preparation. Experience strengthens confidence. Repeated action strengthens identity. The process remains grounded in reality. Attention quietly determines whether alignment becomes possible. Every day presents countless competing demands, notifications, opinions, distractions, unexpected problems. Without conscious attention, priorities become reactive rather than intentional. People begin responding to whatever feels urgent instead of what truly matters. Alignment asks a different question. Does today's attention reflect tomorrow's priorities? That question changes everything. Because attention is more than observation. Attention is investment. Where attention repeatedly goes, energy follows, learning follows, growth follows. One of the most overlooked truths about personal development is that identity is continuously negotiated. Not once, every day. Every decision quietly votes for a particular version of yourself. Reading one chapter casts a vote. Keeping one promise casts another. Avoiding one difficult conversation casts another. No single vote determines the outcome. The accumulation does. Life resembles an election more than a lottery. Character is rarely decided by one dramatic event. It is gradually shaped through repeated participation. There is wisdom in asking a different question each morning. Not, what do I feel like doing today? Nor, what outcome do I want? But, what action would be consistent with the person I am becoming? Notice how this shifts attention away from emotion and toward direction. Feelings become important, but they no longer become the sole authority. Identity begins guiding behavior instead of waiting for behavior to create identity. This perspective also changes how setbacks are understood. Missing one workout does not erase the identity of someone committed to health. A rejected proposal does not erase the identity of an entrepreneur. A disappointing performance does not erase the identity of an athlete. Temporary outcomes become chapters, not conclusions. The person remains committed to direction, even when individual moments disappoint. That resilience often separates lasting growth from temporary enthusiasm. Perhaps alignment is best understood as quiet integrity, not perfection, not constant success. Simply the gradual closing of the distance between what you value and how you live. That distance rarely disappears overnight. It narrows through repeated decisions. One conversation, one habit, one courageous choice at a time. Eventually, something remarkable happens. The future no longer feels like a distant destination. It begins expressing itself through the ordinary moments of today. As this chapter draws to a close, another question quietly emerges. If acting in alignment with our future self can reshape identity over time, why do so many people misunderstand the deeper meaning of Neville Goddard's teachings altogether? What if the greatest obstacle has never been the philosophy itself, but the way it has been interpreted? That question leads us into the next chapter, where we will explore the most common misunderstandings surrounding Neville's ideas, and why separating philosophy from exaggeration may be the key to understanding them at all. Chapter 9. Common Misinterpretations of Neville's Teachings. Few thinkers have experienced a stranger fate than Neville Goddard. Decades after his lectures, his ideas continue to circulate through podcasts, YouTube videos, social media clips, online communities, and short quotations shared millions of times. Yet something curious often happens whenever ideas spread across generations. The ideas become shorter, simpler, more emotionally appealing, and sometimes less accurate. Complex philosophies are often compressed into catchy slogans. Nuanced ideas become motivational sound bites. Eventually, people begin responding to interpretations rather than to the original ideas themselves. This happens in philosophy. It happens in psychology. It happens in science. And it certainly happens in personal development. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding surrounding Neville Goddard is not whether people agree or disagree with him. It is whether they are discussing what he actually emphasized. or a simplified version that has gradually evolved online. One of the most common misunderstandings is the belief that thought alone is sufficient. The idea sounds attractive. Think differently, and life will automatically become different. There is something emotionally comforting about that promise. It removes uncertainty. It removes effort. It removes complexity. Unfortunately, human life rarely operates so simply. Psychology consistently shows that beliefs influence behavior. Behavior influences outcomes. But between thought and outcome lies an entire chain of decisions, habits, relationships, opportunities, circumstances, and unpredictable events. Thought matters. It is rarely the only factor. A person who believes they can improve is often more willing to learn. Someone who expects growth may persist longer after setbacks. Those differences matter enormously, but they matter because they influence participation, not because they suspend reality. This distinction protects both hope and honesty. Another misunderstanding is the belief that difficult emotions should disappear. Some people conclude that if they truly understood Neville's philosophy, they would never experience fear, doubt, disappointment, or uncertainty again. Human psychology suggests otherwise. Fear has biological functions. It prepares attention, protects survival, encourages caution when caution is appropriate. The objective is not to eliminate emotion. It is to develop a wiser relationship with emotion. Confidence is not the absence of anxiety. Courage is not the absence of fear. Emotional maturity is not emotional numbness. It is the ability to acknowledge feelings without allowing every feeling to dictate every decision. This understanding aligns remarkably well with modern approaches to emotional regulation. A thoughtful awareness often proves more useful than emotional suppression. There is another misunderstanding that quietly influences countless lives. Many people mistake visualization for achievement. Visualization has genuine value. Researchers studying athletes, musicians, surgeons, and performers have shown that mental rehearsal can improve preparation when combined with deliberate practice. But visualization alone cannot replace practice. A pianist still needs thousands of hours at the keyboard. A marathon runner still trains. A physician still studies. An entrepreneur still solves real problems. Mental rehearsal prepares performance. It does not replace performance. Perhaps imagination functions best when it becomes companion to disciplined action rather than an alternative to it. Some people also misunderstand Neville's emphasis on assumption. Assumption is sometimes interpreted as pretending reality no longer exists. This creates unnecessary confusion. Reality matters. Bills still arrive. Relationships still require communication. Health still requires care. Markets still fluctuate. People still make mistakes. Acknowledging reality is not the opposite of optimism. It is a foundation upon which meaningful optimism is built. Hope becomes practical only when it engages honestly with the world as it exists. The architect studies the land before constructing the building. The pilot checks the weather before departure. Preparation never requires denying reality. It requires working intelligently within it. Perhaps one of the deepest misunderstandings concerns responsibility. There is an important difference between accepting responsibility for your choices and accepting blame for everything that happens in life. These are not the same. No philosophy should encourage someone to believe they are personally responsible for every illness, accident, injustice, or tragedy. Life is more complicated than that. Circumstances emerge from countless interacting causes: social systems, economics, relationships, biology, chance, history. Personal choices remain important. They simply do not explain everything. Healthy responsibility asks, what influence do I still have? Unhealthy responsibility asks, how am I personally responsible for every outcome? One creates agency. The other creates unnecessary guilt. The difference is profound. There is also a widespread belief that positive thinking alone guarantees positive outcomes. History offers little evidence for such certainty. Successful people experience rejection. Athletes lose championships. Scientists encounter failed experiments. Businesses collapse despite thoughtful leadership. Loving relationships sometimes end despite sincere effort. Life remains unpredictable. Positive thinking does not remove uncertainty. What it often changes is persistence, resilience, problem-solving, creativity. People who maintain constructive expectations frequently continue searching for solutions after others have stopped looking. That difference may significantly influence outcomes, not because optimism controls reality, but because optimism often changes participation within reality. Another misunderstanding deserves attention because it quietly affects many ambitious people. Some begin chasing emotional intensity rather than meaningful progress. They seek constant inspiration, powerful feelings, peak motivation. Yet psychology repeatedly demonstrates that long-term success depends less upon emotional intensity than behavioral consistency. Feelings fluctuate, habits remain, motivation rises and falls. Systems continue operating. The writer who produces one page every morning often accomplishes more than someone waiting for extraordinary inspiration. The investor contributing modestly each month often benefits more than someone waiting for the perfect moment. The person walking 30 minutes every day usually develops greater health than someone exercising intensely for 1 week before quitting. Consistency often appears ordinary. Its long-term effects are anything but ordinary. There is another subtle misunderstanding hidden beneath many discussions of Neville's work. People often become fascinated with external results while overlooking internal transformation. They ask, how do I get the promotion? How do I attract success? How do I achieve my goal? Useful questions, but perhaps not the deepest ones. A more enduring question might be, who am I becoming while pursuing these things? Because goals eventually arrive, or they change. Careers evolve, relationships shift, financial circumstances fluctuate. Identity remains a companion present through every chapter of life. Perhaps the most valuable transformation is not acquiring something external, but becoming someone internally capable of meeting life with greater wisdom, resilience, and integrity. Philosophy has always wrestled with the relationship between perception and reality. The Stoics emphasize perception. Existential philosophers emphasize responsibility. Modern psychology studies cognition, behavior, attention, and emotional regulation. Neville Goddard approached similar questions from his own philosophical and spiritual perspective. Although these traditions differ in important ways, they often meet at one practical insight. The stories people repeatedly believe about themselves influence the choices they repeatedly make. The explanations differ. The observation remains remarkably familiar. Thought matters. Identity matters. Attention matters. Action matters. Reducing any one of these ideas to a single slogan diminishes them all. Perhaps wisdom begins where certainty ends. Instead of asking, which philosophy explains everything, a better question might be, what helps me become more thoughtful, more responsible, and more intentional? That question encourages curiosity rather than ideology. It allows ideas to become tools instead of dogmas. Every meaningful philosophy should invite deeper observation of life, not blind agreement. Every psychological insight should encourage greater understanding, not rigid certainty. Perhaps Neville's greatest contribution was never providing all the answers. Perhaps it was encouraging people to look inward with greater seriousness than they had before. That invitation remains valuable regardless of where one ultimately stands. As we approach the final chapter, one last question quietly remains. If expectations shape behavior, if identity influences action, if imagination prepares the mind, and if philosophy becomes most valuable when it transforms ordinary living, then how do these ideas actually look in everyday life? How do timeless principles leave the lecture hall, enter the kitchen, the office, the gym, the classroom, the family dinner table, and quietly reshape the ordinary moments from which every extraordinary life is built? That is where our journey reaches its final destination. Chapter 10. Bringing philosophy into everyday life. Philosophy becomes valuable only when it survives ordinary life. That may sound surprising. Many people think philosophy belongs in lecture halls, ancient books, or long conversations between scholars. They admire profound ideas, underline meaningful quotations, and collect insights that feel intellectually satisfying. Yet there's a quiet danger hidden within knowledge. Knowledge can become another form of entertainment, A person may spend years studying discipline without becoming disciplined. They may read hundreds of books about relationships while never learning how to listen. They may understand every theory about confidence while allowing fear to make every important decision. The distance between knowledge and transformation is not measured by intelligence. It is measured by practice. Every philosophy eventually asks the same question. How will you live? Not tomorrow, not next year, today. Throughout this journey, we have explored expectation, identity, imagination, attention, self-concept, and action. Each of these ideas is powerful, yet none of them exists in isolation. They function more like the gears inside a clock. Each influences the others. Expectation shapes attention. Attention influences decisions. Decisions become habits. Habits reinforce identity. Identity shapes future expectations. The cycle repeats every day, whether we notice it or not. Perhaps personal transformation is not about discovering one magical principle. Perhaps it is about understanding the relationship between many small principles working together. One of the greatest misconceptions about changing your life is believing that change begins with extraordinary moments, a dramatic breakthrough, a powerful seminar, an unforgettable conversation. These experiences can certainly inspire us, but inspiration fades. What remains are ordinary Tuesdays, quiet mornings, routine afternoons, unexpected inconveniences, small conversations, simple choices. The quality of life is determined far more by these ordinary moments than by extraordinary events. This realization is both humbling and liberating. It means your future is rarely decided during life's biggest days. It is quietly negotiated during its smallest ones. There is an ancient philosophical idea that deserves renewed attention. The Stoics believe that character is revealed not by what people intend to do, but by what they consistently practice. Modern psychology arrives at a similar conclusion through the language of habits. Repeated behavior gradually becomes automatic. The brain learns efficiency. What once required deliberate effort slowly becomes familiar. This is why the first difficult conversation feels exhausting. The 10th becomes easier. The first morning run requires determination. The 100th becomes routine. The first attempt at writing feels uncertain. Eventually, writing simply becomes part of life. Consistency changes effort, not because the task becomes smaller, because the person becomes different. Many people underestimate the power of ordinary identity. They wait for extraordinary confidence. Yet confidence is often nothing more than accumulated familiarity. Someone comfortable speaking before large audiences was once uncomfortable. Someone managing a successful company once faced their first uncertain decision. Someone admired for emotional resilience once struggled to regulate difficult emotions. Mastery often looks mysterious from a distance. Up close, it usually consists of repeated ordinary actions. The extraordinary is often ordinary repeated long enough. Attention remains one of the most practical places to begin. Every day, countless voices compete for your awareness. News, notifications, social media, advertising, opinions, arguments, predictions. The modern economy is built upon attention. Companies compete for it. Algorithms optimize for it. Entire industries depend upon capturing it. The question is no longer whether something deserves your attention. The question is whether you consciously choose where your attention goes. Attention is one of the few resources equally distributed among all people. Everyone begins each morning with the same 24 hours. What differs is where those hours are invested. Attention eventually becomes identity, because whatever repeatedly occupies the mind gradually influences the person. There is another lesson hidden inside everyday decisions. Most people think discipline means forcing yourself to do difficult things. There is some truth in that, but discipline is also an expression of self-respect. Every promise kept to yourself quietly strengthens trust. Every promise repeatedly broken weakens it. Trust is not only something developed between people, it also develops within a person. When you consistently do what you say you will do, even in small matters, your mind begins treating your own commitments as credible. This internal trust becomes remarkably valuable. It creates stability during uncertainty. Relationships reveal another dimension of philosophy rarely discussed. People often search for techniques that improve communication, yet techniques matter less than presence. Listening carefully, remaining curious, responding thoughtfully rather than reacting immediately. These behaviors are not complicated. They are simply uncommon. Many conflicts continue because each person is preparing an answer while the other is still speaking. Attention again becomes decisive. To truly notice another human being may be one of the greatest forms of respect. Presence cannot solve every disagreement. It changes the quality of many conversations. Work follows similar principles. Meaning rarely arrives fully formed. It develops through contribution. People frequently ask, "How do I find my purpose?" Perhaps another question deserves equal attention. How can I become useful today? Usefulness creates opportunities. Opportunities create experience. Experience reveals strengths. Purpose often emerges through participation rather than endless reflection. Many meaningful careers were never planned perfectly. They were discovered while moving. Waiting for absolute certainty often delays discovery itself. Creativity offers another important lesson. Creative people are frequently described as inspired, yet most accomplished artists describe something different. Routine, practice, persistence, showing up. They understand something many people overlook. Creativity is not merely an emotion. It is also a discipline. Ideas appear more frequently when the mind repeatedly creates space for them. The musician continues practicing. The filmmaker continues editing. The researcher continues experimenting. The writer continues writing. Action invites inspiration far more reliably than waiting for inspiration invites action. Health provides perhaps the clearest illustration of accumulated choices. No single healthy meal transforms a body. No single workout creates lasting strength. Likewise, one unhealthy decision rarely determines a future. The direction matters more than the isolated event. Life resembles compound interest. Tiny investments repeated consistently produce results that eventually appear dramatic. The challenge is that compound growth remains almost invisible while it is occurring. People often quit because they cannot yet see progress, not realizing that progress has already begun beneath the surface. Patience becomes one of the most underrated psychological strengths. Perhaps this is where Neville Goddard's philosophy becomes most practical. Whether someone interprets his ideas spiritually, philosophically, or psychologically, one enduring invitation remains. Become conscious. Become aware of the assumptions quietly directing your life. Ask better questions. Notice your internal dialogue. Observe your expectations. Pay attention to your identity. Then allow those observations to influence how you participate in the world. Not because thought alone transforms reality, but because awareness often transforms participation. Participation transforms experience. Experience gradually reshapes identity. The process is subtle, yet profoundly human. There is wisdom in accepting two truths at once. Some things remain outside your control. Other things remain entirely within your influence. You cannot determine every opportunity that appears. You can influence your preparation. You cannot predict every conversation. You can influence how thoughtfully you respond. You cannot eliminate uncertainty. You can become someone who meets uncertainty with greater calm. This balanced perspective avoids two extremes. It rejects helplessness. It also rejects the illusion of total control. Between those extremes lies responsibility. That is where meaningful growth usually occurs. Perhaps the greatest lesson hidden beneath every chapter is this. Your life is not changed by isolated moments of inspiration. It is shaped by repeated moments of attention. Every day, ask quiet questions. What deserves your focus? What assumptions deserve examination? What habits deserve repetition? What kind of person are your decisions quietly creating? Those questions rarely produce immediate answers. They produce something far more valuable. Awareness. And awareness is often where transformation begins. As this journey reaches its conclusion, one final question remains. After exploring expectation, identity, imagination, self-concept, action, and philosophy, what is the one idea capable of bringing them all together? If someone remembered only a single lesson from everything we have explored? What should it be? That is the question we will carry into our final reflection, where every thread of this conversation comes together into one enduring principle about the way we choose to live. Conclusion. Living in the end begins today. Perhaps the greatest ideas are not the ones that give us new answers. Perhaps they're the ones that teach us how to ask better questions. Over the course of this journey, we have explored expectation, identity, imagination, attention, belief, responsibility, and action, not as isolated ideas, but as parts of a much larger picture. Each one influences the others. Each quietly shapes the person we become. Yet beneath all of them lies one simple truth. A human life is rarely transformed in a single moment. Transformation is usually too quiet for that. It happens while no one is watching. It happens in ordinary conversations. It happens in the choices made on ordinary mornings. It happens in the promises you either keep or quietly abandon. It happens in the thoughts you repeatedly return to. Most people expect change to arrive dramatically. Life usually introduces it much more gently. One of the most remarkable qualities of the human mind is that it is always learning, whether we intend it or not. Every repeated thought teaches it something. Every repeated behavior strengthens something. Every repeated emotional response becomes slightly more familiar. This is why change can feel both difficult and beautifully possible. The same mind that learns limitation can also learn possibility. The same habits that reinforce old identities can gradually build new ones. Nothing changes overnight, yet almost everything changes through repetition. Perhaps that is one of the quiet miracles of being human. We are constantly becoming. Throughout history, philosophers have disagreed about many things. Psychologists continue debating theories of behavior, consciousness, and motivation. Different traditions use different language. Some speak of virtue. Others speak of cognition. Some emphasize belief. Others emphasize behavior. Yet beneath those differences, there is a common thread. The person you repeatedly practice becoming gradually becomes a person you naturally are. That idea is neither mystical nor mechanical. It is deeply human. Character grows through repetition. Wisdom grows through reflection. Confidence grows through evidence. Trust grows through consistency. The future grows through today's participation. This is why living in the end deserves a more thoughtful interpretation than it is often given. It is not an invitation to escape reality. Reality deserves honesty. Difficult conversations still need to happen. Bills still need to be paid. Relationships still require patience. Health still requires care. Dreams still require effort. The future does not arrive because we pretend it already exists. It becomes more likely when today's choices begin reflecting tomorrow's values. Perhaps living in the end is simply another way of asking one profound question. If I were to become the person I hope to be, what would today's decisions look like? That question quietly changes everything. It changes how you begin your morning, how you respond to disappointment, how you treat people, how you spend your attention, how you use your time, how you speak to yourself when nobody else is listening. The future begins expressing itself long before it becomes visible. There's another lesson worth carrying forward. Many people spend years searching for certainty. Life offers something more valuable: direction. A compass is useful precisely because the destination has not yet been reached. If you were already there, you would no longer need guidance. Likewise, purpose is not about removing uncertainty. It is about continuing to move thoughtfully despite uncertainty. You do not need every answer before taking the next meaningful step. You simply need enough clarity to continue walking. Clarity often arrives through movement, rarely before it. There is a tendency in modern culture to celebrate dramatic transformation, before and after photographs, overnight success stories, sudden breakthroughs. These stories are inspiring, but they can also become misleading. They quietly hide the years of invisible work that came first. The mornings nobody celebrated, the failures nobody noticed, the habits nobody applauded. Life is usually changed in private long before it is recognized in public. The strongest roots always grow beneath the surface, long before anyone admires the tree. This is why attention may be one of the greatest forms of responsibility. Where you repeatedly place your attention becomes an environment in which your mind develops. Every article you read, every conversation you have, every thought you rehearse, every habit you repeat, every belief you strengthen, these are not isolated moments. Together, they become your psychological environment. Just as a garden reflects what has been planted and cultivated, the mind gradually reflects what has been repeatedly nourished. Attention is not merely observation. Attention is cultivation. There is also freedom in accepting that no philosophy will remove every difficulty from life. No psychological insight will eliminate uncertainty. No worldview guarantees perfect outcomes. Life remains beautifully unpredictable. People will disappoint you. Plans will sometimes fail. Unexpected opportunities will appear. Unexpected losses will arrive. The goal has never been controlling every circumstance. The goal has always been becoming someone capable of responding wisely to whatever circumstances appear. That kind of strength cannot be borrowed. It must be practiced, one ordinary day at a time. Perhaps the deepest misunderstanding about growth is believing that becoming someone new requires rejecting who you are today. Growth is not self-rejection. It is self-development. The child who learns to walk does not reject crawling. The musician does not resent beginner lessons. The experienced leader does not erase the uncertainty they once carried. Every version of yourself made the next version possible. Respect the journey. Do not become imprisoned by it. Your past explains you. It does not have to permanently define you. There's a quiet question worth carrying beyond this audiobook. Not, what do I want my life to become? But, what kind of person are today's choices quietly creating? Because every conversation shapes character. Every habit shapes identity. Every repeated action strengthens a direction. Life is less like a single decision, and more like 1,000 tiny votes cast every day. Eventually those votes become character. Character becomes destiny, not because destiny was written in advance, but because repeated choices gradually become a way of living. If there is one image worth remembering, let it be this. A lighthouse does not chase ships. It does not force the ocean to become calm. It does not remove storms from the horizon. Its purpose is much quieter than that. It simply stands, steady, consistent, faithful to its direction. Storms come, fog arrives, waves rise, yet the light remains. Perhaps your deepest values should function in the same way, not eliminating uncertainty, but quietly guiding you through it, again and again, day after day, year after year, until the direction itself becomes part of who you are. If this conversation has given you something to reflect upon, if it has encouraged you to look at psychology, philosophy, and the human mind with fresh curiosity, then I warmly invite you to become part of the MindFlow Studio community. Here, we explore timeless ideas, modern psychology, human behavior, and philosophies that continue shaping the way we think, choose, and live. Each audiobook is an invitation to slow down, ask better questions, and discover perspectives that remain useful long after the video ends. If that journey speaks to you, I'd be honored to have you subscribe and join us for the next exploration. And as you leave today, perhaps carry just one thought with you. The life you are moving toward is not built by the extraordinary moments you occasionally experience. It is quietly shaped by the ordinary choices you repeatedly make. Choose those moments well, because one day, you may look back and discover that the future you spent years searching for was patiently being built by the person you chose to become.